But it really struck me at the end, sort of at the end of all of it, was, the military had to discover not just sort of how to manipulate the mind, but in manipulating the mind and all of the experiments that were done, they also unleashed these anomalous capabilities. And you read little bits about them, and you've had folks on that have been involved in some of that, whether it's the remote viewing or astral projection or any number of things that get described, by individuals.
Even people who've been possessed, Nick.
Right, right. And when you start to look at that, and then you look at some of the other things that have happened, and we report on this, some of the work of Esther Brooks, for instance, with using hypnosis to create what we would call today the Manchurian candidate, that ultimate sleeper, if you will, trained to just do whatever it is that you've trained them to do. These kinds of things actually took place, and when you look historically at, what came of that, it also tells you a lot about human consciousness. And then when you look at the backdrop, sort of the merger of technologies today, where you have nanotechnologies and biotech and information technologies and many others merging in a way that converging, if you will, into a super kind of science. And there's some specific breakthroughs that will revolutionize everything, particularly the modeling of the human brain, because it's very complicated. And as a result, it takes a lot of computing power to analyze it and then to utilize that in a way that, yields you some ability to even, say, transfer information directly to the brain. Those are the kinds of things that are being discussed, and the questions that come up are, well, how much, who decides the curriculum, if you will, as an example.
Are you concerned that the human mind, is going to be used and abused, basically?
I am a little bit, and actually I'm not alone in that. There was a PBS PBS special called 22nd Century, and their opening episode, their pilot episode actually, was called The Worldwide Mind. And what it was about is the theory that suggested that at some point in this century that all the minds on the planet will be linked just like the internet is linked today.
Sure.
And that concept, I think we are already so linked. We're just a little bit unconscious about it. But to do it artificially, if you think about this in terms of that, then do you really evolve? A person has a thought, and do you have the thought police? I mean, does that become a real concept? I mean, everyone, when you start to think about that, and the idea that science is saying, hey, this is going to be possible, just because some things are possible doesn't mean we should do them. and that's where I'm at on some of this. Or if we do it, we have to be mindful, very mindful, of what we're doing.
We'll talk ESP next hour, but let's just chat a little bit more about the Manchurian candidate. And first of all, do you think this truly occurred, either in the former Soviet Union or here in the United States, trying to find someone that they could manipulate, not as an assassin, but as a candidate?
Boy, that's an interesting question. That's a very interesting question. I've never really thought about it. As an assassin, that comes up. As a super spy, that comes up. And in the literature, the answer to those would be absolutely yes. Would someone groom, someone to become a national leader? That would be possible. When you think about this, and this is some of the things that all of us need to contemplate. When you look at what our government has done covertly that we know about, which is way more than we ever wanted to know, and you consider technologies that would allow you to preempt a national leader. I mean, one of the classic things in organizing politically is preemption, which is where you go in and you try and co-opt the leadership. Because if you take the leadership, usually everybody else follows. This is a standard way of looking at changing a population's mind. And when government does it, we do it in diplomacy. We do it with whatever tools are available. And the real question is would we use these tools to create a more cooperative government? And the answer is absolutely yes. And I think the history proves it. In fact, there's a great book in terms of a projection into the future that was so dead-on accurate, it just stuns me, because it should have been a history book. Instead, it was a projection. It was written in the early 70s, And there was a book called Between Two Ages by Zbigniew Brzezinski, who was talking about these kinds of models. In other words, being able to influence behavior was one of the things that he talked about, and the idea that whether it was liberal or conservative, for different motivations, they would preserve some kind of rationale for using this type of technology, whether it's to further some political end or what have you.
Well, I do believe it's very possible that they have attempted at least to groom people for this kind of control, whether it's through hypnosis or an actual implant into their brain. They've got the capability to do this. 40 years ago, Nick, if we would talk about governments manipulating and controlling, that the Gulf of Tonkin was manipulated, that possibly the knowledge of Pearl Harbor prior to the attack was known, that our government did not experiment with people with chemicals over St. Louis, for example, in the 50s, that we didn't drop chemicals to test to see what the reaction would be on sailors on some ships. 40 years ago, if we were on the radio talking about that, people would have thrown us off a cliff.
Yeah, they'd have burned us in the parking lot for sure.
Yeah, they would have said, no way is our government doing that. And so many people have made one major mistake, one flaw in their reasoning. And because, I would get emails 10 years ago from people who said, look, I know you were in the Navy, I know you're a patriot, but why don't you love this country? And I'd have to email them back and said, don't confuse loving this country with criticizing, pointing out, and investigating people in government who are abusing what this great country is all about.
I absolutely agree with that. And, in our part of the world, we've seen some serious things happen in that regard, and we continue to, as the news unfolds up here related to oil and gas and a lot of other issues. But when we look across, I think the possibilities today are quite unique. This generation, our generation, those alive today, have the opportunity to totally alter the direction in which we're going. And consciousness and how we sort of adapt to the technologies we've created and in fact solve the problems that we've also created are going to require a whole new kind of thinking. And this is what was interesting, is this leap, this idea that, forget about the idea of manipulating. And we understand that. I mean, can you imagine, as an example, if people's full conscious ability were unleashed? And let me give you the example, and I think we've used it before, but it's just such a good one. And it's, if you take the supercomputers of today and you string 3 of them together, you can map in real time a 3-dimensional image of a neuron firing in the brain, a whole neuron firing chain. And that's a lot of computing power. I mean, each one of those supercomputers does 280 teraflops a second, more or less. And this is equal to 6.6 billion people with hand calculators every 5 seconds doing a calculation for 60 hours to do what one of those do in a second. So it's a lot of numbers crunching. Now think about it. And yet it only can capture one neuron firing chain in real time in the human brain, which, what does that tell you about the human brain in terms of what it's doing? Oh, it's amazing. I mean, the capability, it's a quantum computer. We each have one on our shoulders, and a quantum computer, by illustration, would have the capability, by comparison, if we ran that supercomputer I just described for 1 trillion years, 1 trillion years ran that supercomputer. Think of all those people with hand calculators.
Absolutely. And in my case, we're dealing with 1950 computer technology in my head.
Right. Well, and here's the thing, though, is it gets down to, at that rate, in 1 hour, that's what a quantum computer will do, what a supercomputer will do in 1 trillion years. And so this next breakthrough in science, which I believe we're going to see, there's some things that have happened the last year or so, and then brain modeling becomes something very different, because then you're looking at things like complete memory sets. Now imagine that. And this is the direction in which a lot of the research has been headed since at least as far back as the 1980s. And the idea of for learning, accelerated learning. If it's neutral, like mathematics, maybe that would be interesting. But if it's, if it has values based in it, you're basically dumping information